It's value chain I hate.
I won't mention value chain. So there are two value chains.
So this study is about the competitiveness of the German aviation market, correct?
Exactly. Background is slow traffic development compared to other parts of Europe, and a discussion about high location costs in the German air transport market.
And the location cost, this is actually what you use in order to measure the competitiveness of the aviation market, the German aviation market, right? I think this is the one of the key points you're looking at. Is that correct?
Yeah, we in our study, we model the relevance of the location costs. In the public discussion, location costs play a major role, especially raised by stakeholders of the value chain of the air transport sector. But of course, there are other factors as well that have an impact on the competitiveness of the German aviation market, right?
But, this is, I think, when we talk about the discussions about the competitiveness of the German aviation market, people will typically reflect on the cost, right?
Yes.
I think this is really what the
Yes.
main discussion is about. And this is also why you focus in your study mainly on the cost side of the aviation market,
Yeah,
so to
that's
say.
right. Empirically, we look at the cost. When it comes to measures we propose, we also look at other factors that also have impacts actually on cost,
Right.
but for other reasons, like competition also can have impact on cost levels and so on. Yeah.
So what kind of cost? What is the main cost factor and what do you find about the cost?
Yeah, we basically, first of all, divide between location costs in general and governmental location costs or governmentally driven location costs.
So what can you give us some examples?
Yes, so in general, location costs, as we define them, are those costs that occur when actually an aircraft or pilot decides to land at a certain place, right? So en route costs like fuel costs, ATC en route charges are not part of our location costs. So,
I see.
But when we say, okay, a certain aircraft decides to land at airport A or airport B, probably airports quite close to each other, but in different countries, could be like Cologne or Brussels, for example. The actual costs that will pop up at this particular airport are our location costs.
Right. So it's really like the airports, the cost that the airlines experience when they use certain airports in Germany. This is really playing a major role for your study.
And then these location costs have different components. Right? You have governmental cost components like air passenger duties. Big one in Germany, relatively big one. In the UK.
What's the share? Air passenger duties, what's if you look at the overall airport cost for airlines, passengers, air passenger duties, what is the share? Is it like 5%? Is it 50%?
It depends, of course, on the airport, but it can go, I don't have the exact figures in mind now, but it can be around 30-40%.
So that's really substantial.
That is substantial.
And that's sort of government-driven.
That's government-driven, completely government-driven.
Right.
But that's not the only government-driven cost component. We also have security fees or charges they are called, right? And it is they depend on a governmental decision, on a political decision, to what extent air passengers are supposed to pay for their security screening.
And this is Germany is a federal state, right? So there are several small states and they all decide on their own way of handling those security charges. Is that correct? Or is there like a federal regulation?
It's organized by the federal police.
I see.
But at each location, the cost calculation is independently depending on locational factors.
Okay.
Right? And the actual services are provided by third-party firms on behalf of the federal police.
I see. Okay, so this is like around 30 to 40%. Okay, and then there are the non-governmental driven costs, and this is around making then around the rest, so to say.
Yes,
50 to
so
60%.
it really depends on the actual airport, so and on the flight, because these air passenger duties can I think they can also be higher than 50% in total. We have security fees, and we have ATC landing and takeoff fees. These are the three main public or politically driven charges. And then, of course, we have the traditional airport charges,
Right.
like weight-based landing fees, passenger-based landing fees, passenger-based charges, infrastructure usage charges, and so on.
Right.
That's all the packet the airport offers and charges.
And now the
to its
big
airport.
question is, how are these charges, these different charge components in Germany compared to, I guess, other European countries?
Exactly. Yeah.
And
And here we
what
are.
do you find?
The German airports, the German hubs, the German secondary airports, and also the smaller German airports, they are all among the most expensive airports in Europe. In general, so if you want to draw a simple picture, you can say that the Netherlands and the United Kingdom tend to be even more expensive when
Right.
it comes to such charges. Then comes Germany and airports in other countries, especially in Southern Europe, but also in Ireland, for example, or in Scandinavia,
That's
are
interesting.
massively less expensive.
Massively less expensive.
Massively less expensive, yeah.
All right. So on the other hand, when we talk, okay, so the costs are high. The difference in the cost between airports in Germany and other European airports. So is it mainly driven by government, these government-related charges, or is it rather driven by, let's say, landing fees per passenger charges by the airport, or is it the security charges? Is it those other charges? What is driving these differences in the cost? Is it the governmental-driven, or is it the other charges by the airport?
Both, but mainly the governmental-driven ones.
Really?
So this is where some countries do not charge such costs at all, and Germany has a relatively high air passenger duty. Of course, German airports tend to be also more expensive when it comes to normal airport charges. But here, also the airports like Dublin or Madrid or Oslo, they also have to charge airport charges. So here's a difference in relative sense.
So what would be your
high.
recommendation then? Would your recommendation be that the German government should reduce their share of the cost?
In our study, we have not only looked at cost and at charges and so on. So our recommendations are not like direct political recommendations. So policymakers, please do this and that. But we have opened up a waste amount or a waste scope of different fields where political action could probably help to decrease total cost of air transport.
Right.
So, and of course, one option could be to lower or to abolish the air passenger duty. We found that in the last 5 years, the air passenger duty explained about probably 9% of the passenger gap we have since COVID. Like the recovery in Germany is much lower, 20% lower than in the rest of Europe, right?
Right. I mean, for instance, in Poland,
Yeah.
22% up. relative
So
to COVID. In
Poland
Germany,
and
it's kind of Germany is the other way around.
The winners in the last years have been places in Southern Europe and Poland, for example. And then there are other countries which struggle a bit, but not as much as Germany. And Germany, at least among the biggest countries, is the one which has performed weakest. I mean, still 20% less passengers in the intra-European market compared to pre-COVID is a big gap.
It is.
20 million departing passengers within Europe alone. We have not looked at long-haul passengers, so we only have looked at intra-European It's the intra-European market. So, and the passenger duty explains about 9%, let's say 10%.
And the passenger duty exists, it hasn't been there always, right?
No, it was introduced in 2000, don't let me lie now, 11 or 12.
So more than 10 years ago.
Financial crisis, yeah. It was introduced and then it was increased several times, also during COVID, interestingly.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So it was, but I feel like my understanding is that other countries have similar charges that they impose on the passengers.
There is a small club of mainly Western European countries which have passenger duties.
Yes.
I mean, traditionally the UK is the country with, which I think it was the country which was the first one to introduce such a duty.
Interesting.
And they also have a more sophisticated concept. They do not only differ by destination or by stage length to the final destination, but they also look at cabin class, for example. So business or premium economy or first class passengers pay much more than economy class passengers. Germany has a more simplified way of charging the air passenger duty, so they just differ between three bands, like intra-European short haul, medium range, and long haul. And I think the long haul charge is about 70 euros now per departing passenger.
Which is quite substantial.
Quite substantial, but this can, I think for business class UK, the charge in the UK can be more than 200 or 300
That's
pounds.
interesting,
Yeah.
right? I mean, because we see that UK, London Heathrow is actually doing quite well.
Yeah.
And they charge even more than what we see in Germany.
Yeah.
And so this, I think, is a very interesting
Yeah.
Observation that, I think that the getting back to the cost side, it matters. There's no question about that, but it doesn't seem to be the only thing that matters.
Yeah.
And what you said is that you also look beyond the cost, right? And that the kind of recommendations or policy reforms that you sort of outline in your study go beyond just cutting costs. So maybe we can talk a little bit more about, what are your recommendations?
Yeah, we can do that, but let me briefly comment to what you just said. Sure. It is right that at first sight you could say, okay, Heathrow performs well despite much higher location costs, or probably there are also passenger duties in France or in the Netherlands and they also perform better. Nevertheless, I would be cautious in a way that you can say this explains that such costs have apparently no impact, because without the passenger duty, probably air traffic in the UK would be even higher. Yeah?
Right.
So I think what we have found out definitely is that there are so many factors that play a role, and obviously, whenever you have costs and you have a negative price elasticity of demand, a reduction of costs will lead to increased throughput and demand. So this we have to keep in mind. But
and you highlight this in your study, because I think this would be a very important contribution. Just understanding, okay, so people, when we talk about the competitiveness of the German aviation market, people typically talk about the cost, and they matter. But there are so many other things that matter as well, and this is what you highlight in your study.
Exactly.
It makes a lot of sense. I think this is a very good thing to do.
Yeah. In our study, we had a qualitative and a quantitative approach. In the quantitative approach, we did a regression analysis to see how the most obvious potential demand drivers have an impact. So we looked at location costs and GDP development.
Right.
And also we had an HHI competitiveness, a competition indicator. So
HHI basically measuring the concentration of the airline markets, right?
Exactly.
The airline market would be defined by airport pairs, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So, but regarding the HHI, the results were less straightforward. But what we found out is that both GDP and location costs explain about 9, maybe 10% of the passenger gap. So,
right, which is
meaning
substantial,
significant, but there are other factors are supposed to be there as well.
right?
We qualitatively had a look at such other factors. And I think we talked to a lot of stakeholders and everyone seems to more or less agree, even though we could not prove the significance of such factors in a quantitative way. But if you start, for example, I mean, COVID-19 was a big structural change when it comes to how people do business, right? In the past, almost every meeting was in person. Nowadays, there is video conferencing. And the German domestic market was, it performs really weak. So I talked about a recovery of 20%, of 80% overall, but the domestic market has only recovered by 50% in Germany. So the gap is 50% compared to pre-COVID.
It's amazing. And is this? I'm not sure this is covered by your study, but because there is always this domestically, definitely there is this intermodal competition, rail, aviation. Is it that those people that don't fly? Do we have any idea about whether those people that don't fly don't travel, or do they travel on rail?
So what, of course, the data availability is quite weak, so we have no rail passenger data, but first of all, you see that the total number of rail passengers has recovered much more than the domestic air passenger numbers. So apparently people are using the railways again, but only 50% of the people who used to fly still fly.
And so, also because in the actually the German, there have been some shocks, if you wish, to the rail market because of there have been some big changes in terms of the ticket prices for the rail companies. I'm not sure this is sort of
so we also mentioned that
in the sense that they have been lowered very substantially for many rail users.
There are two things that happened. First of all, VAT was reduced to 7% for long-haul rail. It used to be 19%, but VAT for German domestic flights is 19% still. Also for long-distance buses, by the way. So this is an advantage for the rail sector, which may have resulted in decreasing ticket prices. In addition, there is a new thing called the Deutschland ticket, Germany ticket, which means if you buy it, it's not expensive, maybe 50 euros, 57 euros per month. You can not only use public transport in your hometown, but also you can use public transport all over Germany for free.
Right.
I mean, okay, we talk about decreases in aviation, and I doubt that many people who used to fly from Hamburg to Munich now take the suburban trains to Munich, because then it would take you 10 or 12 hours. Right. But there are some factors which can make you believe that there have been shifts to rail. Also, during COVID, air transport was stopped. I think almost everywhere in the world, air transport was reduced because there was simply no demand anymore, so supply was reduced as well. And the German long-distance trains, they continued to operate. Right. The taxpayers paid for it, and they operated almost empty all over COVID, and frequencies were not reduced at all, or hardly reduced, maybe a few percent. So this means rail transport has always been operational or remained operational. So it was a reliable transport system even during COVID. And then when demand started to increase again, when the sanctions, the measures were lifted and people started to travel again, what they found was a functioning railway sector, but not a functioning air transport sector, because the airlines, it took them much longer to build up their operations again. And this makes us believe that many people, business travelers, switched to rail, probably even earned status points there and so on, became gold card members, and probably have stayed as customers of the railway sector. Also, I mean, frequencies in aviation have reduced dramatically. So now that capacities have built up again, they are much lower than before COVID. But as said, in the railway market, frequencies, have never been reduced. So if you go from Frankfurt to Berlin, or Frankfurt is a bad example because it's a hub route which has recovered relatively well, but from Cologne to Berlin in the past, you had maybe 12, 14 flights per day. Now you have 2 flights or 3 flights per day, but you have a train every hour at least or minimum, right? And so if you want to travel on a flexible way, you don't know how long your meeting will take, probably the train is much more convenient now. You have free Wi-Fi.
Because also you can, I mean, that's the point, right? I mean,
you can work on the train.
I think it's more, it's easier to work on the train rather than in the plane, because in the plane is typically, it's just, there's not enough space for for using the laptop, and on the plane, it's actually on the train. Actually, it's no problem at all. Yeah, actually,
of course there are delays, but I think people will decide by route and by occasion what kind of transport mode they will choose. But there is another transport mode as well. It's called car, right?
Yes.
And a car offers enormous flexibility for owners of a car. And so it's reasonable to assume that former air passengers now use trains and cars.
We talked a lot about rail, although it's mainly about aviation. But I kind of made us talk about rail because I think it is an important factor, because a lot of things have happened in aviation as well as in rail. So, and there clearly is this intermodal connection between intermodal competition between rail and aviation, and cars and buses and so on. But get back to your recommendation. So, what do you identify as the main factors that could contribute to an improvement in the competitiveness of the German aviation market?
Yeah, we have differentiated between 2 or 3 pathways or groups of factors of potential measures. So we have formulated them in a way that we do not offer fully designed measures, but we offer in our study, we offer ideas the Ministry of Transport could consider, and they could say,
which was your client?
Exactly, that was our client. So directions in which they could do further research and evaluate if such directions or measures could make sense. First of all, measures that help at reducing costs directly, and then measures that help at increasing competition, and by this that could lead to lower costs along the value chain.
Competition among airlines,
for example, or among airports, among ATC service providers.
I think this is a big factor, right? The ATC providers, an important part of your recommendation. We do not have any quantitative figures because we do not know to what extent ATC charges would lower based on certain measures. But it's a fact that there is at the bigger German airports, there's only one provider, and probably there could be more competition, like who gets allowance to operate at a certain airport. At the moment, also there is a unit rate defined for all airports, a unit ATC rate, and so the incentive currently is cost subsidization and so on from larger to smaller airports and all that stuff. So the incentive is not that big at the moment to really do something. So I think there could more competition in the ATC field. And I think when you talk about more competition, you mean that, okay, so there is a government government, Deutsche Flugsicherung,
Yeah.
right? Government-owned company providing air navigation services. But I think something important that you highlight in your study is that their experiences from other countries, and they have a much more diverse group of air navigation service providers.
Yeah.
And they use it, and it actually changes things. And especially when we talk about location cost or the cost of the users of the aviation system, air transport system in Germany. And I think this is an important, basically what we are talking about is a private air navigation service providers, right?
Yeah. So many ways, if you look at other European countries, you get ideas what you could probably do as a government,
Right.
and where you could think about potential measures to increase competition and to reduce costs.
So, and there is no indication that if you change the system that there is any sacrifice with respect to safety. This is what I would assume.
We have not looked into this, but I mean, we talk about countries like the UK, very established aviation countries where there's much more competition.
In Scandinavia, I guess, right?
As well, I think. So I'm not the biggest specialist in ATC, but you see there.
No, there is no obvious evidence, so to say, that
Exactly.
there could be any sacrifice with respect to safety, but rather,
I would say
okay,
so,
the service quality could perhaps be increased and perhaps even at low cost. So I think this is something that we would perhaps expect from moving from a market that is sort of we have a protected big company and moving to a more sort of diverse, competitive environment.
Yeah.
This is what we think. We are economists, right? So we think that competition is something that leads to some positive outcomes because it basically creates an environment where companies earn money by getting better than others, and then they try to reduce their costs to be more competitive on the pricing side, and also, try to be more convenient in order to produce a better service quality. And if you have a more competitive market, then you create an environment where those things are rewarded, and then this is apparently other countries is seemingly making use of this, and it seems. There's no reason to believe that it's kind of, there's no obvious disadvantage of this, right?
Exactly.
So what are there? Okay, we're talking about air traffic control. What's the next important one?
You could also look at airport costs, like incentives regarding airport charges, even though in the last years airport charges have not increased that much. Then there could be other ways as well to improve the competitiveness.
So now we are moving from the government sort of, because at the beginning you said, there are these two types of charges. One are more government driven and the others are more airport driven, if you wish.
Yeah.
Of course, airports are often government owned, but But okay, so now we are talking about the airport-driven sort of share of the airport cost.
Yeah.
Of the user of the charges that airport users have to pay, basically, and some are more government and some are more airport users, airport-driven. So what is when we talk about the airport-driven part? So what would be the key insight that you have derived from your study?
Yeah, I think three aspects. First of all, there is no independent airport regulator in Germany.
Right.
We have 16 federal states. Each has an airport regulator, which is part of the federal government, and most airports are owned directly or indirectly by the federal government. Not all, but most. So there may be conflicts of interest. This is one thing.
Right.
The second thing is there is usually no incentive regulation. So you have maybe cost plus regulations. But I think price cap is not used as much in Germany.
Which is something that you use at London, that the regulators use in London Heathrow, and for instance also Dublin Airport.
Okay, yeah.
Right.
And the third thing is, I know there has been big discussions, and each measure has its pros and cons.
Sure.
But we have dual till in Germany regarding charges regulation, and probably single till could also make sense, or could make more
single
sense.
till is actually, first of all, the difference between single till and dual till is that with single till, you're using the revenues from non-aeronautical supplies like car parking revenue in order to cover part of the infrastructure cost. And this means that typically the airport charges for infrastructure, the use of the airport infrastructure would be lower with a single till versus dual till, where with a dual till you use the infrastructure charges to basically cover the infrastructure costs. So typically this would lead then to higher infrastructure user charges. And the issue is that, and actually, if I according to my memory, Dublin as well as London Heathrow, they both use a single till approach. Right?
Yeah, so this is at least the whole complex of airport regulation, at least is something where we propose the government to have a deeper look at it, to do benchmarking with other countries, to investigate if this could be a pillar. And there are strong economic hints that there could be a pillar to reduce cost. Even though in the last 5 years, airport charges in Germany have increased less than in other European countries.
Nice.
But we have only looked at 5 years. But on the other hand, airport charges in general are also relatively high already in Germany.
And I mean, what you said is there is 16 states, and they have their airports, and they have their own regulator. And they, of course, there's a strong correlation. And I think the states, they will be benefiting from either lower subsidies needed to pay to the airports, or even if there is an airport revenue, the airport is profitable, then they will also gain from the profits. And that sort of could be explaining why maybe there is a dual till rather than a single till. Because it's actually not just the airport benefiting from this, but also the federal state. So not the federal state, but the states, so to say, at the state level. And it seems because then this is quite actually this is very interesting because. For a lot of reasons. So if we talk about this, I think then this will be a long discussion. But I think that is a very important point, actually, that you are highlighting there in this study. Yeah.
Regarding airports, we also think that in Germany, regarding airport slots. Or more competition, more
so the
supply.
Airport slots, just to be, so that there is no misunderstanding. So an airport slot is sort of used to limit the traffic at an airport where there is a limited capacity relative to the demand.
Exactly.
And then you're basically using slots, which is like a permission to use the slots, which are given to the airlines. And then since they are limited, this limits traffic, and this helps controlling congestion.
Exactly, this is the case. And I mean, we have a European-wide slot regulation, so Germany does nothing special here, so they just apply the European regulation. And I think the administrative way of giving available slots to new entrants, all this works fine. This is not something we criticize.
Yeah.
But the aircraft size is currently not officially, at least not officially considered, right? So in the last years, plenty of slots were available due to the traffic decline. So this was not a big problem. But imagine in the future when traffic goes up again, and then you have slots which are used by maybe 150-seater aircraft or 100-seater aircraft. But now we have large A321s, for example, with 240 passengers, used by airlines like Wizz Air, Eurowings, EasyJet. And in this case, of course, it would probably make more sense to give such slots to these larger aircraft, or to have incentives to use larger aircraft. So the European slot regulation could probably be amended in a way that more focus is given to larger aircraft.
May I say the European slot regulation basically follows the IATA slot guidelines, scheduling guidelines, and there are two important features here. One is grandfathering, which is basically the way the slots are allocated to airlines is by looking backwards. So who has used the slot in the past? And if you have used the slot in the past, you can be safe that you will get the slots also in the future. That's one important feature. And the other has to do with, although airlines are allowed to swap slots. Swap means without any financial side payments. Basically, you give me this slot, I get this slot. And then we like the swap. We're happy with this, and then IATA will approve, or the slot coordinator will be approving this, right? But there is something used, such as slot trading, for instance, in the UK, which is quite, I would say, one of the countries that really promotes this kind of policies, is to allow airlines to just buy slots from other airlines, right? And that is something that I don't feel is existing in Germany.
No, it's not. I think it's forbidden. And this is also something which could probably help to give slots a market value, so to make sure that the highest willingness to pay gets a certain slot. This is a long-term measure, where much research and probably much also political willingness is needed to change this
system. I'm not sure actually whether it's really much research needed.
Maybe not research.
This is economics 101. So people, you have two companies, and one company can make good use of the slot and another company not so good use of the slot. And then what you want to do is you want to allow the airline that can make a good use of the slot to buy the slot from the airline that cannot make such a good use of the slot. And that is something that we have very good experiences with this, for instance, when it comes to the climate policies of Europe, where we have this emission trading scheme. Exactly. And the emission trading scheme is basically the same idea. There are some people, for them, it's difficult to, it's very costly to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. For others, not as costly. So let's let them trade. And then, everyone benefits from this. And the same logic applies to slots.
So let's say it in a way, it's more a political willingness which is needed.
I think there is a slight difference here, because the emission trading scheme is a much bigger market compared to a slot market at a particular airport.
At a particular time, even maybe.
So I think there is some. The analogy is not perfect, but still, I think we have experiences with these kind of market mechanisms, and they have been applied also in the aviation markets in the US, in the UK, and I think this is really. It's very difficult to find. Very strong reasons not to allow for slot trading.
There's another point, airport related, which also relates a bit to slots. So, airports in Germany, they say good night at 11 p.m. and they say good morning at 6 a.m. Right?
So, night curfews.
So, night curfews. So 1/3 of the day, the airport landscape in Germany is closed. That means neither the airports nor the airlines can earn any money during that time. So where will airlines base their aircraft? Probably at those places where the aircraft can fly 4 or 5 turnarounds per day.
And the point is that aircraft are very expensive.
They are expensive.
And you earn money with aircraft only if it's in the air.
Exactly.
If it's standing at the airport, there is no money earned, and it's a very expensive asset.
Exactly.
And then
probably I place my aircraft at London Stansted, where I can even land at 1 a.m. in the morning. If I placed it in Germany, except for Cologne maybe, or Hanover, but most airports are closed at night, and then you would have to schedule your flights in a way that the last flight arrives before 11 p.m. And this makes operations out of Germany more expensive to some extent.
I had my own experience. I think landing it was a Frankfurt airport, where the aircraft was there was some interruption, and a lot of people came late, and it was around the time of the curfew. And then everyone was stranded at the airport.
Yeah.
And there was no way.
Yeah.
It was just not allowed to fly those passengers out because of the delays that have happened.
Yeah.
And everybody, all these, like a large crowd of passengers from different flights, all had to find hotels around the Frankfurt area, which was very difficult.
Yeah. So this comes on top. So you have, if you operate out of a curfewed airport, first of all, you have less flights per day to earn money, right? And if such irregularities happen, you have additional costs on top. And all this is not existing, definitely not in Istanbul, not in Dubai, and probably also not in Bergamo, right? Or in Stansted. And this makes a difference when it comes to the attractiveness of the German aviation market.
I can say this was a very inconvenient experience.
I believe so.
Definitely. I was looking for a hotel in the middle of the night, and I had to take a taxi to get to the hotels. And I didn't know whether there was, which was very expensive, and I didn't know whether there was any chance to, to even find a hotel at the place where I went, because that was, So that was definitely a very unpleasant experience. So the curfews. I mean, of course, there's a reason for the curfews, which is noise protection.
Yeah,
so a lot of the in-house.
But this is something we argue as well in the study. So there are more intelligent ways of dealing with noise and noise protection. Yeah, you could say a certain amount of noise at night is okay. And this amount could split over a few noisy flights or some more less noisy flights.
It's like a noise budget.
A noise budget, for example. Also, airports have become less noisy, but these noise...
I mean, the aircraft have become much less noisy, right?
But these curfews have not been lifted. In contrast,
noise is a big issue. Noise is a big issue. This is why in our our neighbors in the Netherlands actually are seem to be putting very tight limits on their aviation markets. Noise is one of the big reasons for this.
But trains operate at nights, cars operate at nights. So I have not seen any curfew on streets yet. So this is a special regime applied to aviation, and
I mean there are speed limits. Speed limits are relevant only at night. So there is some differentiation when it comes to, which are also related to noise protection.
But interestingly, you just named the Netherlands. The speed limit they had, which was just lifted now due to the new government, but in the Netherlands, cars were allowed to drive faster at night than during the day. So it was 100 during the day.
Inside the city?
No. On the motorways, the speed limit, which had been in operation the last, 5 years or so. It's a speed limit of 100 kilometers per hour per day. And from 8 p.m., it's 120. So,
All right. So what is the final, what is the main conclusion when it comes to, the German aviation market hopeless in terms of its competitiveness, or?
I think we identified so many pillars, and if the government decided to look at some of these and maybe to change even smaller things here and there, they could, from our perspective, already change something. Of course, they also asked us what the effects of an abolishment of the air passenger duty would have resulted in. So we looked ex post, meaning, so if the air passenger duty had not been increased in 2020, we would have 2 million departing passengers more now, or 4 million in total. This is the same as in a scenario where the GDP in Germany would have developed by 4.6%, like in other European countries, compared to the actual development of 0.1%. And of course, it's easier for policymakers to reduce the air passenger duty than to increase GDP by 4.5% GDP growth. But as said, there are so many other measures as well. Policymakers should have a look at to somehow improve the sector in the long run as well.
Right.
Yeah. It's not just about taxes.
So hopefully your study can contribute to a better understanding of the aviation sector, and I hope also of a better understanding of the importance of the aviation sector for the economy as a whole. I think this is something that very often is, the relevance of transport, infrastructure, transport, and also including aviation markets for the economy. I think this is something that still, my feeling is it's not appreciated as much as it should be, and not taken as a strategic policy angle that is worthwhile, investing in and trying to improve and see what can we do as in Germany. And I think also we should be thinking in terms of European, as Europeans, so to say, because we have the European market, which is actually a very big achievement actually in Europe, that we have these like single European aviation market. And all right, so let's hope that your study can have some impact and help contribute and help improve the competitiveness of the German aviation market.
Yeah, we hope so. And maybe to close off with, that's why we also propose to come up with an air transport strategy which should be related also to overall economic and tourism strategies. At the moment, I think the German government lacks a strategy how to proceed with the tourism sector, with the overall economy, with the transportation sector, with air transport. And, much work to do.